Zara, a 10-year-old black girl, faces subtle manipulation from her white teacher, Mr. Whitman, who crosses personal boundaries in her school. Would a 10-year-old girl speak of or keep silent? Before we get into the story, here are some reminders to those who are parenting. It's essential for parents to foster open communication with their children and teach them to recognize uncomfortable situations, even when they involve trusted authority figures. Encourage your child to speak up if something feels wrong, and always take their concerns seriously, as subtle signs of discomfort may signal deeper issues. Zara sat at the small wooden desk in her 5th grade classroom, her hand resting on the lined paper in front of her. The room was alive with the hum of murmured conversations and the scratch of pencils as her classmates worked on their morning writing assignments. Zara, however, had already finished hers. Writing came easily to her. Words flowed effortlessly from her mind to the page, and her imagination often felt too big to be contained by a single notebook. She looked up at the clock, its hands ticking steadily toward lunchtime, then glanced at her teacher, Mr. Whitman. He was writing something on the blackboard, his faded sweater hanging loosely over his thin frame. The other students seemed to view him as a kindly old man who'd been teaching for as long as anyone could remember, but Zara found him a little strange. Not in an obvious way, but in the subtle glances he gave certain students when he thought no one was looking. Zara, a voice whispered from her right. She turned and saw her best friend, Amira, peeking at her from behind her own notebook. Amira's wide brown eyes were playful, and a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "You finished already?" Zara nodded and smiled back. "Yeah, it was easy." Amira glanced at Mr. Whitman, then leaned closer. "He's going to ask you to read it out loud. He always does that when you finish first." Zara shrugged. She didn't mind reading her work in front of the class, but Amira's warning made her stomach tighten. She hadn't really noticed it before, but it seemed true. Mr. Whitman often called on her when he could have picked someone else. "Maybe," Zara whispered back. "But I don't think he'll today." She went back to her writing, but the tight feeling in her chest didn't go away. She loved school, loved learning, and had big dreams of becoming a famous writer one day. But sometimes she felt out of place in this predominantly white school. Her town was small, and being one of the few black students at the school made her stand out in ways she didn't always want. Her grandmother often reminded her that standing out wasn't a bad thing, especially as a black girl with ambition. "They'll notice you, sure, but make them notice your mind," her grandmother would say, her voice strong with pride. "You've got a voice, Zara. Don't ever be afraid to use it." Zara admired her grandmother more than anyone. She had marched in civil rights protests back in the day, standing up to police officers with nothing but her dignity and a sign held high. Zara felt that power, that legacy, deep inside her, but sometimes it was hard to feel brave when everything about her school reminded her that she was different. As Mr. Whitman turned back to the class, his eyes scanned the room, then landed on Zara. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Zara," he said, his voice soft and measured, "would you like to read your work to the class?" Amira shot her a knowing glance, but Zara stood up and nodded. She moved to the front of the room, clutching her paper, feeling her classmates' eyes on her. She wasn't nervous about the reading itself, she was confident in her words, but something about the way Mr. Whitman looked at her made her uncomfortable, as if he was always watching her a little too closely. She read her piece aloud, her voice steady, and the class responded with polite applause. Mr. Whitman smiled again, nodding approvingly. "Excellent work, Zara." "As always." Zara thanked him and returned to her seat, but the uneasy feeling lingered. She brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just imagining things. Mr. Whitman had been a teacher for decades. He was probably just being supportive, right? But as the day went on, Zara found herself glancing at him from time to time, wondering why that small smile of his didn't sit right with her. Weeks passed, and Zara tried to forget about the strange feeling she'd had in Mr. Whitman's class. For the most part, school continued as usual. She aced her assignments, spent her lunch breaks with Amira, and tried not to worry about the little things that seemed off. But Mr. Whitman's attention didn't go away. If anything, it increased. "Zara, could you stay for a moment after class?" he asked one afternoon, as the bell rang and students started packing up their things. Zara hesitated. She had planned to meet Amira outside for lunch, but Mr. Whitman's request sounded polite enough, so she stayed behind as the classroom emptied. Yes, Mr. Whitman, she asked, standing by his desk. He smiled, the same gentle smile he always gave. I wanted to talk to you about your essay. You're very talented, you know that? I think you have a bright future ahead of you. Have you considered entering some writing contests? Zara shifted on her feet. No, I haven't. But I can ask my mom about it. You should, Mr. Whitman said, leaning forward slightly. Someone with your talent shouldn't go unnoticed. I could even help you prepare. We could spend some time after school working on your writing together. Zara forced a smile. Thank you, but I think I'll talk to my mom first. Mr. Whitman nodded, though there was something about the way he was looking at her that made her feel uncomfortable. She couldn't quite place it, but his eyes seemed to linger too long, as if he wasn't just looking at her as a student, but as something else. Her skin prickled. Well, you know where to find me, he said, his voice still soft. You're a special student, Zara. You shouldn't let that go to waste. Zara nodded, muttered a quick thank you, and left the classroom as fast as she could. She met Amira outside, her mind racing. She didn't understand why that conversation had felt so strange. Mr. Whitman had been nice, hadn't he? He had complimented her, offered to help. So why did she feel so unsettled? What took you so long? Amira asked as they headed toward the cafeteria. Mr. Whitman wanted to talk to me about my writing, Zara replied, trying to keep her voice casual. He thinks I should enter a contest. Amira frowned. He's always talking to you after class. It's weird. Zara shrugged, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Amira was right. Maybe he's just trying to help. Amira gave her a skeptical look but didn't push it further. They spent the rest of lunch talking about other things, but Zara's mind kept going back to Mr. Whitman's offer. It had felt off, and yet she couldn't figure out why. He hadn't done anything wrong, exactly. He had only complimented her work, but something about the way he spoke to her made her feel uneasy. Over the next few days, Zara found herself trying to avoid Mr. Whitman's gaze in class. She skipped staying late to help him with small tasks, and she made sure to stick close to Amira whenever she could. But it didn't stop him from calling on her in class more often, or from asking her questions that felt too personal. Questions about her family, her hobbies, her dreams. One afternoon, he asked her to stay behind again. I need some help organizing the classroom, Mr. Whitman said as the other students filed out. Would you mind staying for a bit? Zara hesitated, her heart racing. Something told her to say no, but she didn't want to seem rude or disrespectful. She was taught to respect her teachers, after all. I have to meet my mom soon, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Maybe another time? Mr. Whitman's smile faltered, just for a second, but then he nodded. Of course, of course. Don't worry about it. Zara rushed out of the classroom, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was wrong. She wasn't just imagining it anymore. Mr. Whitman's attention felt too much, too focused. And now, the fear that had been simmering inside her was starting to grow. The next few weeks were a blur of tension for Zara. She had always enjoyed school, but now she felt a constant anxiety gnawing at her whenever she entered Mr. Whitman's classroom. She continued to avoid staying late and tried to deflect his increasing attention during lessons, but the uneasy feeling never left her. It was as if she were constantly waiting for something to happen, though she couldn't say what that something was. One day after lunch, Mr. Whitman approached her at the end of class. His gentle smile and quiet tone were the same as always, but there was an insistence in his voice that set Zara on edge. Zara, he began, I need your help with some books in the back room. It will only take a few minutes. Zara froze. Her mind raced with excuses, but none of them seemed good enough. She glanced at the door where Amira had just left, wishing she had gone with her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that refusing would make things worse. After all, she was just a student, and Mr. Whitman was her teacher. Wasn't it her job to listen to him? Reluctantly, she nodded. Okay. Mr. Whitman led her toward the back of the classroom, where a small storage room was tucked away near the restrooms. The room was cramped, filled with dusty old books and forgotten school supplies. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, casting an odd glow on the room. As soon as they stepped inside, Zara felt her throat tighten. The room was too small, and the door behind them closed with a soft click that made her heart race. She could feel Mr. Whitman's presence behind her as she scanned the shelves, trying to stay focused on the task. "Why don't you take a look at the books over there?" Mr. Whitman said, pointing to a stack on a lower shelf. Zara knelt down, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the books. She couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on her. The room felt suffocating, and the silence between them was thick and uncomfortable. Then, without warning, Mr. Whitman spoke again, but his tone was different this time. Softer, almost too personal. "You know, Zara," he said quietly, "you're very special. Not many students have the kind of potential you do." Zara stiffened, clutching the book in her hand. She wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Mr. Whitman stepped closer, and Zara's pulse quickened. He wasn't saying anything overtly wrong, but his words felt too intimate, too focused on her. His compliments weren't about her schoolwork anymore. They were about her, and it made her feel trapped. "I could help you go far, you know," he continued, his voice low. "But you have to trust me. We could spend more time together, working on your writing. No one else would understand your talent the way I do." Zara's heart was pounding in her chest now. She tried to stand, but the narrow space of the storage room made her feel claustrophobic. She managed to push herself upright, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. I really have to go," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "My mom's waiting for me." Mr. Whitman paused, and for a moment, Zara could see something change in his eyes, something cold and calculating. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by his usual mild smile. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. "Don't let me keep you." Zara didn't need any more encouragement. She practically ran out of the storage room, her legs shaky as she made her way down the hall and out into the sunlight. Her chest heaved with relief, but the fear didn't go away. In fact, it settled deeper into her bones, making her realize that what had just happened wasn't right. Mr. Whitman hadn't touched her or said anything overtly wrong, but his presence, his words, they felt wrong. Deeply wrong. She rushed home that day, her thoughts spinning. How could she explain this to anyone? How could she make someone understand what she barely understood herself? Over the next few days, Zara became more withdrawn. The once carefree walks to school with Amira now felt heavy with unspoken fear. She hadn't told her best friend about what had happened in the storage room. She wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding like she was making something out of nothing. But Zara knew deep down that it wasn't nothing. At home, her mother noticed the change in her behavior, but with her long work hours, she didn't have time to ask many questions. Zara's grandmother, however, wasn't so easily distracted. "You've been quiet lately, baby," her grandmother said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. "Something on your mind?" Zara shrugged, stirring her soup without much appetite. "I'm fine, Grandma." Her grandmother leaned forward, her eyes soft but full of wisdom. "You know, when I was your age, we had to fight just to be heard. People didn't want to listen to us. They didn't want to believe that a little black girl's voice mattered. But it does, Zara. Your voice matters." Zara looked down at her soup, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She wanted to believe her grandmother's words, but part of her was terrified. What if she told someone what happened with Mr. Whitman, and they didn't believe her? Or worse, what if they blamed her for it? The next day, Zara avoided Mr. Whitman as much as she could. She rushed through her assignments, never volunteering to stay late or help with anything. But he continued to watch her, his eyes following her in ways that made her skin crawl. "Hey," Amira said during lunch, nudging her with concern. "You've been acting weird lately. Is everything okay?" Zara hesitated. She wanted to tell Amira, but the words felt stuck in her throat. What if Amira didn't understand? What if she thought Zara was overreacting? But at the same time, Zara knew she couldn't keep this to herself forever. The weight of it was becoming too much. I think something's wrong with Mr. Whitman," Zara finally whispered, glancing around to make sure no one could hear. "He's been acting weird with me. Like, really weird." Amira frowned, leaning in closer. "What do you mean? What's he done?" Zara struggled to explain. "It's hard to say. He hasn't done anything bad, exactly, but the way he talks to me, the way he looks at me, it just feels wrong. Like he wants something from me, but I don't know what." Amira's face grew serious. "That doesn't sound right at all. You should tell someone, like the principal or your mom." Zara shook her head quickly. "No. What if they don't believe me? Mr. Whitman's been at this school forever. Everyone loves him." Amira paused, her expression thoughtful. "But you can't keep this to yourself. If it's making you uncomfortable, you have to say something." Zara knew Amira was right, but the fear still gnawed at her. What if speaking up made things worse? What if Mr. Whitman turned on her, or the school blamed her for misunderstanding his intentions? The uncertainty was paralyzing. For the rest of the week, Zara couldn't concentrate in class. Her grades, once perfect, began to slip, and her teachers, noticing her change in behavior, asked if everything was okay. But Zara just nodded, avoiding their eyes. She couldn't explain the storm of fear and confusion swirling inside her. At home, Zara's grandmother tried to engage her in conversations, sensing that something was wrong, but Zara remained silent. She didn't want to worry her grandmother, and besides, she didn't have the words to explain what had happened. One night, after another restless sleep, Zara found herself sitting at her desk, staring at a blank page in her notebook. She used to love writing, used to fill pages with stories and dreams. But now, the words wouldn't come. All she could think about was Mr. Whitman's lingering gaze, his soft voice whispering that she was special. She was beginning to hate that word. Zara tossed and turned all night after her conversation with Amira. Her friend was right. She couldn't keep this to herself any longer. The tension inside her had grown unbearable, and the idea of facing another day in Mr. Whitman's class without doing something filled her with dread. The next morning, after much hesitation, Zara approached her school counselor during recess. She'd never had a reason to go to the counselor's office before, so the unfamiliarity made her anxious. The counselor, Mrs. Hill, was a kind woman with a calm demeanor. Zara had seen her around the school but had never spoken to her personally. "Hi, Zara," Mrs. Hill said with a warm smile as she gestured for her to sit down. "What brings you here today?" Zara sat down, nervously twisting her fingers in her lap. She didn't know where to start or how to explain what had been happening. The words seemed jumbled in her mind, like a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. I don't really know how to say this," Zara began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something's been happening with my teacher, Mr. Whitman." Mrs. Hill's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly, encouraging Zara to continue. "What do you mean, Zara? Has Mr. Whitman done something that makes you uncomfortable?" Zara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. He talks to me in a way that doesn't feel right. It's not what he says exactly, but how he says it. Like he's trying to get close to me in a way that makes me feel weird." Mrs. Hill's brow furrowed as she listened. "Has he touched you or done anything inappropriate?" Zara quickly shook her head. "No, not like that. But the way he looks at me, the way he asks me to stay after class all the time, it just feels wrong. I don't know how else to explain it." Mrs. Hill sat back in her chair, her face thoughtful. "I understand that must be really difficult for you, Zara. Thank you for coming to me and sharing how you're feeling. I want you to know that your feelings are valid, and we'll look into this." Zara bit her lip, unsure if she was being taken seriously. "But what if no one believes me? He's been at this school forever, and everyone loves him." Mrs. Hill's gaze softened even more. "Zara, what you're describing is serious. If you're feeling uncomfortable, it's important that we take that seriously. I'll need to have a conversation with the principal, and we'll figure out the next steps from there. You're not alone in this." Zara felt a small flicker of relief but also fear. She had done it, she had told someone. But now, the terrifying question of what would happen next loomed over her. Would Mr. Whitman find out? Would people believe her? What if she had made things worse? When Zara left the counselor's office, her stomach still churned with anxiety, but at least she had taken the first step. Now all she could do was wait. The news spread quickly. Zara didn't know how it happened, but within days, whispers started to circulate around the school about her meeting with the counselor. Some of the kids in her class gave her strange looks, and others avoided her altogether. It was as if the school had turned into a different place overnight. Amira was the only one who stayed by her side, but even she seemed worried. "You did the right thing," Amira reassured her one day at lunch, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "But people are starting to talk, Zara." Zara felt a lump form in her throat. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I didn't want everyone to know." Amira nodded sympathetically. "I know. But you couldn't keep it to yourself either. You had to speak up." The days following her meeting with Mrs. Hill were filled with tension. The school administration had launched an internal inquiry into Mr. Whitman, but there was no official statement yet. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire through the small town. Some parents, particularly those in the white community, defended Mr. Whitman, insisting that he was a dedicated, kind-hearted teacher who would never do anything inappropriate. Others, especially in the black community, expressed concern, believing that something might have been swept under the rug for far too long. Zara's life at school became more difficult. She was no longer just another student. She was the girl who had accused Mr. Whitman. Some of the other kids began whispering about her in the hallways, and Zara could feel their stares on her whenever she passed by. A group of boys in her grade even started mocking her, calling her names and laughing at her behind her back. One afternoon, after a particularly harsh day, Zara sat on the steps of the school's entrance, her eyes stinging with tears. She felt more alone than ever, questioning whether she had made the right choice in speaking up. What if she had been wrong about Mr. Whitman? What if all this attention only made things worse for her and her family? Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Your voice matters." But right now, Zara wasn't sure it did. That evening, Zara's mother and grandmother sat her down at the kitchen table. Her mother, exhausted from work but full of concern, held Zara's hand as they talked. "We heard what's been going on at school," her mother said gently. "I know this must be hard for you, baby, but you did the right thing by speaking up. No one has the right to make you feel uncomfortable, and if something felt wrong, it probably was." Zara nodded, but her voice trembled when she spoke. "What if no one believes me?" Her grandmother leaned forward, her voice steady and strong. "Zara, this isn't just about people believing you right now. This is about doing what's right, even when it's hard. You spoke up for yourself, and that's what matters. People might not see it now, but the truth always finds a way to come out." Zara took a deep breath, trying to let her grandmother's words sink in. But the fear of what was still to come weighed heavily on her heart. The days stretched into weeks, and the investigation into Mr. Whitman's behavior continued. The school tried to keep things quiet, but as more time passed, something unexpected began to happen. Other students started coming forward with their own stories. One afternoon, as Zara sat in the library with Amira, a girl from her class, Lena, approached them hesitantly. Lena was quiet and shy, someone Zara had never spoken to much before. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zara exchanged a glance with Amira before nodding. "Sure." Lena sat down, her hands fidgeting nervously. I heard about what you told the counselor," she began, her eyes darting around the room. "And I just wanted to say that you're not alone." Zara blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Lena swallowed hard, her face pale. "I mean, Mr. Whitman used to ask me to stay after class, too. He would say weird things to me, like how I was different from the other kids, and he would always find reasons to keep me behind. I never said anything because I didn't think anyone would believe me either." Zara felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't alone after all. Amira looked at Lena with wide eyes. "Did you tell anyone?" Lena shook her head quickly. "No. I was too scared. But hearing about what you said made me realize that maybe I should." Zara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had felt so isolated, so unsure of herself. But now, knowing that other students had experienced similar things made her feel a surge of both relief and anger. Mr. Whitman had been doing this to other girls, too. Quietly, subtly, making them feel uncomfortable and afraid. As more days passed, more students like Lena came forward. Some had stories of Mr. Whitman making them stay after class for unnecessary reasons, while others described him making inappropriate comments about their personal lives. It was all small, almost imperceptible, but together, It painted a picture of a teacher who had crossed boundaries too many times. The school administration could no longer ignore the mounting complaints. Mr. Whitman was placed on administrative leave while a formal investigation was launched. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, and the community became even more divided. Some parents were outraged that this had been allowed to happen for so long, while others still defended Mr. Whitman, insisting that he had always been a good teacher. Through it all, Zara began to feel a sense of empowerment. Speaking up had been terrifying, but now, with other students sharing their stories, she realized that her voice had mattered after all. She had started something important, a conversation that the school and the community couldn't ignore anymore. As she walked through the halls, a mirror by her side, Zara held her head a little higher. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't powerless. Together, they were stronger than they ever could have been on their own. The investigation into Mr. Whitman's conduct was in full swing, and the atmosphere at school had shifted significantly. Every hallway conversation seemed to revolve around the same topic: Mr. Whitman, the complaints against him, and what would happen next. Some students were still unsure, caught between defending a teacher they'd known for years and believing the growing number of voices speaking out. Others, especially those who had experienced Mr. Whitman's unsettling behavior firsthand, were finding their courage to step forward. Zara had always known that standing up to an authority figure would be hard, but she hadn't anticipated just how isolating it could feel. Despite the growing support from her classmates and even some parents in the community, there were still plenty of people who didn't believe her, or worse, blamed her for what was happening to Mr. Whitman. One morning, as Zara walked into school, she overheard a group of students whispering behind her back. "She's just making it up for attention," one girl muttered. "I bet Mr. Whitman never did anything wrong," another chimed in. "He's been here forever." Zara clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to turn around and yell at them, to tell them that they didn't know what it felt like to be watched and manipulated, but she held herself back. Fighting with them wouldn't change their minds. Instead, she focused on the people who did believe her, the students who had come forward with their own stories, her family, and her close friends like Amira. The tension in the air came to a head when the school held a community meeting to address the situation. Parents, teachers, and students gathered in the school auditorium, waiting for answers. The principal, Mr. Evans, stood at the front of the room, his face serious as he addressed the crowd. "We understand that recent events have caused a lot of concern in our school and in the community," Mr. Evans began. "We take all allegations of inappropriate behavior very seriously, and as you know, Mr. Whitman has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation. This process is ongoing, and we are committed to ensuring that our school remains a safe environment for all students." Zara sat in the audience with her mother and grandmother, listening intently. She knew this meeting wouldn't be the end of it. There was still so much to be done, but it was a start. The school couldn't ignore the problem anymore, not when so many students had come forward. As the meeting continued, some parents voiced their concerns, asking questions about the investigation and what steps the school was taking to protect students. Others, however, defended Mr. Whitman, insisting that he had been a good teacher for years and that the accusations were a misunderstanding. One parent stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "My daughter came home crying last week because she's scared of what's happening to Mr. Whitman. She's never had any problems with him, and now she feels like her favorite teacher is being unfairly targeted. What are you going to do about that?" Zara's heart sank as she listened to the woman speak. She knew that some people would never understand, no matter how many stories came out. They didn't see the subtle ways that Mr. Whitman had manipulated and intimidated his students. To them, he was still the kind, elderly teacher who had been at the school for decades. Mr. Evans responded calmly, reiterating that the investigation would be thorough and fair, but Zara could see the division in the room. This wasn't just about one teacher anymore. It was about the way the school, and the community, had failed to listen to its most vulnerable students. In the weeks following the community meeting, the school began implementing changes. Mr. Whitman was officially suspended while the investigation continued, and it became clear that the complaints against him were part of a larger issue, one that had been ignored for too long. The school administration promised to introduce new policies to protect students, including clearer guidelines for teacher-student interactions and better support for those who came forward with concerns. Zara watched as the school board began to take action, but she knew that real change would take time. The systems in place had allowed Mr. Whitman's behavior to go unchecked for years, and while his suspension was a step in the right direction, there was still much more to be done. One day, as Zara sat with Amira at lunch, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The fear and anxiety that had weighed her down for so long were finally starting to lift. She had spoken up. She had told her truth. And because of that, others had found the strength to do the same. "I'm proud of you," Amira said, smiling at her across the table. Zara smiled back, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Amira shrugged, but her eyes shone with pride. "Yeah, you could have. But I'm glad you didn't have to." As the school year drew to a close, Zara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always loved writing, but now her stories took on a new focus. She began writing about her experience, about what it felt like to be silenced and then find her voice again. She wrote about the importance of standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, and about the strength that comes from speaking the truth, no matter the consequences. Her grandmother, who had always encouraged her to use her voice, beamed with pride when she read Zara's writing. "I knew you'd find your way," she said one evening as they sat together on the porch. "You're going to change the world one day, Zara. Just you wait." Zara smiled, feeling the weight of her grandmother's words settle warmly in her chest. She wasn't sure if she'd change the world, but she knew she had already changed something. She had taken the first step, and that was enough for now. As the sun set on another day, Zara looked ahead to the future with hope. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but she was ready. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to be silenced again.